There is a transmission in the archives that the government says doesn't exist. The frequency was logged. The dates were recorded. The personnel were assigned. And then, every single trace of it was removed. Not lost. Not misplaced. Removed. By the end of this, you're going to know how a government program operated for years, funded, staffed, and actively running, without a single budget line, without a single official record, and without a single person in Congress who was ever supposed to find out. And the strangest part, some of them already knew. Every government program leaves a footprint. That's the first thing you have to understand. A budget request. A departmental memo. An authorization signature. Even the most classified operations in American history, the Manhattan Project, MKUltra, COINTELPRO, all of them left something in the paper trail. A number. A name. A line item buried inside a defense appropriations bill that nobody was supposed to read too carefully. That's how power protects itself. Not by leaving nothing, but by leaving just enough to look normal. So when researchers began pulling declassified records in the late 1970s, after the Church Committee had already cracked open the intelligence community like a rotten egg, they expected to find anomalies. They expected redactions. What they did not expect was a gap. Not a redaction. Not a black bar over a name. A gap. Pages missing from sequential filing systems. Reference numbers that pointed to folders that had never been created. Personnel logs showing clearance upgrades for individuals whose names did not appear anywhere else in the entire departmental record. You're not looking at incompetence here. Incompetence leaves a mess. This was surgical. The gap spanned, depending on which archivist you believe, somewhere between 6 and 11 years. The lower estimate comes from cross-referencing budget cycles. The higher estimate comes from the transmission logs, and we'll get to those. But the important thing right now is this: something was operating inside the structure of the federal government, drawing on resources, directing personnel, and producing outcomes, with no official existence whatsoever. And here is where it gets strange. Because the gap itself was found by accident. In 1978, a federal archivist, we'll call her by the name she used in her deposition, because her real name has never been officially confirmed, was processing a routine transfer of documents from a decommissioned signals facility in the Mid-Atlantic region. Routine. Boxes of old frequency logs, maintenance schedules, staffing rotations. The kind of paperwork that gets transferred, cataloged, and filed in a sub-basement where it will never be opened again. Except one box was different. Inside, beneath a layer of what appeared to be mundane equipment manifests, she found a series of transmission logs. Dated. Sequential. Detailed. The logs referenced a program designator she didn't recognize, a 2-letter, 4-number code that didn't match any known signals program in the master index she had access to. When she ran the code through the standard verification system, the system returned a single response. Record not found. She assumed it was a filing error. She flagged it, submitted a query through the proper channels, and went back to processing the rest of the transfer. 3 days later, her supervisor told her the box had been recalled. The query had been closed. The flagged items were being handled by a different department. She never saw those documents again. But she had done something that would matter enormously, years later. She had written the program designator down in her personal work log. Not because she suspected anything. Simply because that's what careful archivists do. They write things down. That number sat in her personal notes for almost 4 years before a congressional investigator, following a completely separate thread, happened to cross-reference it, and found that the same designator appeared in 3 other unconnected facilities' disposal records. Same code. Same gap in the master index. Same result when queried. Record not found. Now here's the question that should be keeping you up at night. If there's no budget line, where does the money come from? This is not a rhetorical question. Programs cost money. Personnel requires salaries. Equipment requires procurement. Facilities require maintenance. You cannot run an active government operation on nothing, not for 6 years, not for 11 years, not for 6 months without touching a financial system that is theoretically auditable. Theoretically. What investigators began to piece together, and this is where the public record does exist, in fragments, is a mechanism that intelligence historians now refer to, carefully and without drama, as off-ledger resourcing. The concept is straightforward, even if the execution is staggering in its audacity. You take a legitimate program with a legitimate budget. You build in redundancy, overestimates in procurement costs, phantom contractor fees, equipment listed as destroyed that is quietly redirected. You skim carefully across dozens of programs simultaneously, so no single anomaly is large enough to trigger an audit. The individual discrepancies are noise. Together, they are a funding stream. And here's what makes this particularly difficult to prosecute, or even to fully expose: the people managing the legitimate programs often have no idea. The skimming happens at a level above them. They submit their honest paperwork. The numbers get adjusted somewhere between their desk and the final ledger. By the time it reaches congressional oversight, everything looks clean. You are not looking for a villain in a back room counting cash. You are looking at a system that was designed to be invisible from the inside. But before we get to what this program was actually doing during those years, you need to understand something even stranger about the transmissions themselves. The transmission logs that the archivist found were not simply records of communications. They were records of responses. And that distinction matters enormously. A transmission log that records outgoing signals tells you someone was broadcasting. A log that records responses tells you someone was listening and responding on a frequency that, according to every master index in the federal system, was unassigned. An unassigned frequency doesn't mean unused. It means unregistered. It means that whatever was moving across that frequency was moving, officially, through empty air. Signals analysts who later examined the partial records, and we are talking about analysts who came to this material through FOIA requests that took, in some cases, over a decade to fulfill, noted specific structural patterns in the logged responses. Patterns consistent with coordinated, multi-site communication. Not a single rogue transmitter. Not a test signal from a forgotten antenna. Multiple sites. Coordinated timing. Consistent protocol. This was an operation. A functioning, multi-node operation, broadcasting on frequencies that did not exist in any official record. And then, in one of the most quietly devastating details in this entire story, one of the FOIA analysts found something buried in a partially declassified NSA technical review from 1971. A footnote. 11 words. It read, "Anomalous signals consistent with protocol designator, redacted, recommend continued suppression." Continued. Not initiate. Not begin. Continued. Which means that as of 1971, someone at the NSA already knew. Already had a name for it. And had already decided that suppression was the appropriate response. Here is the payoff. Here is what the evidence, fragmentary, contested, and deliberately obscured, actually points toward. The program, operating under at least 2 different designators across its active lifespan, appears to have been a domestic monitoring operation. Not foreign intelligence. Domestic. Targeting not enemy agents, not foreign nationals, but specific categories of American citizens identified through criteria that were never formally defined because they were never formally written down. The targets, based on cross-referencing the personnel files that were recovered against known surveillance programs of the era, fall into recognizable patterns. Journalists. Academics. Specifically, academics working in fields adjacent to government research programs, materials science, behavioral psychology, communications technology. And, most consistently, individuals who had at some point filed official complaints or inquiries about government programs they had encountered in a professional capacity. In other words, the program monitored people who asked questions. And it did so without a warrant process, without a legal authorization framework, without any of the oversight mechanisms that even the most aggressive acknowledged programs of the era were required to at least nominally observe. Because those mechanisms require paperwork. And this program had learned how to exist without paperwork. The full scope, how many individuals, across how many years, under how many designators, remains unknown. Because the records were not just classified. They were, to the extent that the evidence allows us to conclude anything with confidence, erased. You might be thinking, this is history. This is the Cold War era, the shadow of McCarthy, a different government in a different world. And you would be partially right. Except the mechanisms don't disappear. The structural vulnerabilities that allowed off-ledger resourcing in the 1960s were not closed by the Church Committee. They were acknowledged, partially addressed, and then quietly left intact in ways that every subsequent administration found useful. The oversight reforms of the 1970s created new layers of accountability, and new layers of complexity inside which the same techniques could be applied with greater sophistication. The archivist who found the wrong file retired in 1991. She gave one interview, in 1994, to a small publication that no longer exists. In it, she said something that has stayed with researchers who found the transcript. She said, "I don't think about whether what I found was the only thing. I think about how long it would have taken someone to find it if I hadn't written that number down." That's the real lesson here. Not that governments run secret programs, that is not a revelation. The lesson is structural. The lesson is about what happens when the system that is supposed to generate the record, is the same system that decides what gets recorded. You are not looking for a smoking gun. You are learning to read the shape of the smoke. There are currently over 35 million pages of documents in the National Archives still awaiting declassification review. 35 million pages. Some of them are mundane. Some of them are administrative. And some of them have a program designator that won't return a result when you run it through the index. Record not found. If this broke something in the way you think about the official record, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. And next week, we're going into the file that the State Department declassified in 2019, quietly, with no press release, that appears to reference an overseas facility that officially closed in 1955. And was still receiving mail in 1983.